ॐ सहना भवतु सहनौ भुनक्तु सह वीर्यं करवावहै तेजस्विनावधीतमस्तु मा विद्विषावहै। ॐ शान्ति शान्ति शान्तिः। हरि ओम। Readings from Meditation and Spiritual Life, Chapter 4, Different Conceptions about God. Today's first point is the search for the Absolute. Right from the beginning of human civilization, we find that man has been trying to understand the mystery of the universe. On the one hand, he has been trying to study nature as it is, with all its intricate fields and myriads of living beings. On the other hand, he has been trying to find out the origin of the universe. The Shvetashvatara Upanishad begins with these age-old questions of the human mind. Students of Brahman, that is, the Vedas, discuss what is the cause? Is it Brahman? Whence are we born? Why do we live? Where is our final rest? Under whose orders are we who know the Brahman subjected to the law of happiness and misery? In the next stanza, the sages who put these questions to one another continue the discussion about the possible cause of this universe. They take up time, nature, law, chance, matter, energy, mind, and ego for examination and find that none of these nor a combination of these could be the cause of the universe because they are all dependent on something else. After finding that it was impossible to get a solution to the ultimate questions through reason alone, the sages next practiced meditation. In the depths of contemplation, they realized that supreme immutable being called Brahman, who is the self-luminous power in all beings, and who presides over the functions of everything from time to ego. What is the nature of this supreme being? Even as early as the beginning of the Vedic period, we find Hindu sages speculating on this theme. The famous Nasarya Sukta of the Rig Veda says, "There was neither non-existence nor existence, neither this world nor this sky beyond it. What covered and where, and what gave shelter? Was water there, unfathomed depth of water? Death was not then, nor immortality, no sign there was of day and night. That one thing breathless, breathed by its own nature, and there was naught else besides. Darkness there was, at first hidden in darkness, and everything was undifferentiated being. All that existed then was contentless and formless, and through tapas was born the unity." The above quoted stanzas describe the non-dual nature of Brahman as it existed before creation. Even the concept of a pure absolute being limits the non-dual reality. That is why, later on, in the Upanishads, we find the ultimate reality is described using terms like not this, not this. Another school of thought called the Sankhya had a different conception of reality. The Sankhya is a very ancient system of Hindu philosophy, perhaps the oldest. It influenced all the other systems. Its psychology is accepted by almost all the schools of Hinduism. The two fundamental categories of the Sankhya are Purusha and Prakriti. Purusha is the spirit, and Prakriti is the ultimate source of all material things, including the mind and the senses. There are as many Purushas as there are living beings. Purusha corresponds to the Jiva, that is, individual self of the Vedanta. According to both the systems, the self in its real nature is pure consciousness, infinite and eternal. But owing to ignorance, identifies itself with the mind and the body, and is born again and again as a living being. The non dualistic school of Vedanta has the concept of cosmic ignorance or Maya, which roughly corresponds to the Prakriti of the Sankhya. In both the schools, knowledge based on discrimination between the self and the not self is considered to be the only means of liberation of the jiva from its bondage. These are the common points between the Sankhya and the Vedanta. But the Vedanta has the concept of an ultimate reality called Brahman, which is of the nature of existence, knowledge, bliss, absolute, which manifests itself as the souls and the material objects. Again, the Sankhya does not have any place for the Supreme Being or Ishvara, as the Vedanta has. All souls come under the same category, and if in the Sankhya and the Yoga systems there is any reference to Ishvara, it only means a special type of Purusha who is ever free and who is the teacher of all teachers, but he is not the creator. Patanjali states that by devotion and self surrender to this Ishvara, one may directly attain Samadhi. Creation and dissolution of the universe go on eternally in Prakriti. In the Vedanta, the creator of this universe, called Brahma or Hiranyagarbha, is lower than Ishvara, the supreme controller. Ishvara is, according to Swami Vivekananda, man's highest reading of the Absolute. Another peculiarity of the Vedanta is identification of the gods Vishnu, Shiva, or Devi with the Supreme Godhead or Ishvara. The incarnations are also often identified with Ishvara. The Bhagavatam refuses to count Sri Krishna as one of the incarnations of God. He is none other than the Supreme Godhead, Krishna Bhagavan Swayam. So, in a prayer of gods and sages to Krishna, we find this statement: receiving energy from the Purusha of infallible power, along with Maya, holds within himself the Mahat, like the embryonic state of this universe. This Mahat, backed by the same Maya, projected from within itself the golden sphere of the universe of various layers. This kind of identification of the incarnation with the Supreme Being is found in the Bhagavad Gita also, which says, there are two Purushas in the world, the perishable and the imperishable. All beings constitute the perishable, and the Kutastha, which according to Sankara refers to Maya or primordial nescience, is called the imperishable. But there is another, the highest self, the immutable Lord, who pervades the three worlds and sustains them. As I transcend the perishable and am above even the imperishable, I am celebrated in the world and in the scriptures as the Purushottama. Our next point is place of personal God in spiritual life. In the Holy Personality, the devotee sees a link between the finite and the infinite. First, he is drawn by the wonderful charm of the personality, and then, through it, realizes the infinite. We need something to center our feelings upon, and if we do not feel attracted to some holy form, some holy personality, we naturally take up some human idol and become attached to it. But in these great ones, though we are at first charmed by the human aspect, later on we find the divine in them. Here lies the necessity of the worship of an incarnation. If we want to construct a building, we must find a model. In these godmen, we find that their bodies and minds are like glass cases through which shines the cosmic spirit, whereas ours is at best an iron case. Our task is to transmute this iron case into a glass case. Through their superhuman spiritual endeavor, the godmen have shown us the way to transmute the iron case into a glass case. Even these godmen had to perfect their bodies and minds through regular spiritual practice and culture. They too had to perfect their instruments. In the descriptions of these godmen in the Puranas, we find a wonderful blending of the personality and the principle. In their case, the superconscious is manifest through the conscious, and if we are attracted by their human aspect, we will come in touch with the divine aspect in due course. Even the out and out Advaitin is prepared to place before us thoughts that can be understood and grasped by us in our present state. He is willing to take us by the hand and lead us onto higher and higher truths. Idolatry is a necessary stage which people must outgrow. And if people do not take up some holy idol to center their feelings and emotions upon, they will take up some awful human idol, some man puppet or woman puppet, and worship that and becomes slaves to that. Which is the better idol? An ordinary idol of flesh and blood, or an idol which represents a higher ideal? In the human idol, you do not find a higher ideal, and if you try to think of the abstract becomes and remains abstract, while the human idols, the man puppets or the woman puppets, attract all our attention, become essentially real to us, and then everything else follows as a matter of course. To the extent we are able to think of the divine in us as distinct from our personality, as distinct from this man form or woman form of ours, to that extent we will be able to think of the divine in others too as distinct from their form, as distinct from their personality. And then we will be safe. Then we will never become slaves to any male or female puppet. The conceptions about the nature of the divine being, whom men seek, vary with the growth in the knowledge of themselves. Sri Ramakrishna observes, there are three classes of devotees. The lowest one says, God is up there. That is, he points to heaven. The mediocre devotee says that God dwells in the heart as the inner controller. But the highest devotee says, God alone has become everything. All the things that we perceive are so many forms of God. Further, he clarifies the relation between the personal and the impersonal aspects of the Godhead as follows. Think of Brahman, existence, knowledge, bliss, absolute, as a soreless ocean. Through the cooling influence, as it were, of the Bhakta's love, the water has frozen at places into blocks of ice. In other words, God now and then assumes various forms for his lovers and reveals himself to them as a person. But with the rising of the sun of knowledge, the blocks of ice melt. Then one does not feel any more that God is a person, nor does one see God's forms. Our next point is change in the conception of God in ancient India. In our study of the Hindu scriptures, we come across various conceptions of the Godhead. Some devotees speak of him as a possessing both divine forms and attributes. They want to establish a personal relationship with him. Others speak of him as being endowed with infinite power and knowledge and other qualities, and think that, though formless, he assumes various forms. While they take note of the personal aspect, they particularly stress the impersonal aspect of which the former is a manifestation. During the early stages of their spiritual life, most devotees cannot help associating human forms and sentiments with the divine and thinking of him as outside of themselves. Sometimes we find that, as a result of the self purification brought about by sincere devotion, the devotee gets a vision within himself of the same divine being he has been so long worshipping as an outside object. Then he realizes him as the indwelling spirit, as the ear of ear, the mind of mind, the life of life. Next, he finds him to be the one deity who is in the fire, who is in the water, who is in the plants, who is in the trees, who pervades the whole universe, who has become the woman, the man, the youth, the maiden, the old man leaning on his staff, and is born in manifold forms. To him, God is now the principle immanent in all beings and things. He is not merely the God of gods, but is also the true self of all, the life universe. Proceeding further, the seer realizes him as the transcendental entity who is beyond speech and thought, who is invisible, devoid of all connotations, unthinkable, indefinable, essentially of the nature of consciousness, constituting the self alone, the peaceful, the supreme bliss, and the non dual. The Vedic rishis worshipped Indra, the thunderer and the giver of rains, Mitra, the god who regulates the course of the sun, Varuna, the god who dwells in the bright blue sky and releases the penitent from sin, and Agni, the god of fire, sometimes spoken of as father and also as brother, kinsman, and friend. Savitri, the solar deity who stimulates life and activity in the world, was invoked in order to guide the understanding of the devotees. It was a very striking fact that, even at that early stage of spiritual consciousness, some of the Vedic seers could recognize the presence of an indwelling spirit behind each and every natural phenomenon. And behind their apparently polytheistic conceptions, there lay an ingrained monotheism that was clearly expressed, as each god was invoked and worshipped in turn as omnipotent, omniscient, and even omnipresent. This is made clear in the well known hymn that declares, "To what is one? Sages give many a name, they call him Agni, Yama, Matariswan." After the period of the Rig Veda, a revolution took place in Hinduism, especially with regard to the symbols and names associated with worship and prayers. Names that were once of minor importance came to be prominent in later times, and new names were also added to the pantheon. The worship of Shiva, Vishnu, and Devi, and of incarnations like Rama and Krishna became popular in later times. But in the midst of these striking changes, the Hindu devotee's conception of the supreme deity, his highest spiritual hopes and aspirations, his desire to seek divine aid and guidance, and his yearning for spiritual communion have remained unchanged. With the march of time, it has been recognized with greater clearness that the impersonal principle forms the background of all personal aspects of God and is the source of all divine personalities worshipped through various symbols. Indeed, according to Advaita Vedanta, whatever be the symbol one may adopt or the personality one may adore to begin with, the highest goal of spiritual life lies in the ultimate experience of the impersonal, the one without a second, in which the worshipper is merged into and becomes one with the infinite. In that highest experience, all distinctions between man and God and between God and the world vanish. The one without a second alone remains. Based on the above experience, we have in popular Hinduism a number of monastic meditations that negate the not self and assert the self. In his 6 stanzas on Nirvana, Shankaracharya states, "I am neither the mind nor the intellect, neither memory nor ego. I am not the sense of hearing, taste, smell, or sight. I am neither the ether nor the earth, nor the fire, nor the air. I am knowledge and bliss absolute. I am the self all pervading. I am the self all pervading. I am the indeterminate, changeless, and formless, all pervading and omnipresent. I am beyond the touch of all sense attachments. I am not even freedom, never having had any bondage. I am beyond all relative knowledge. I am the self all pervading. I am the self all pervading." This type of meditation is in line with the approach to the reality followed by some of the boldest of the Upanishadic seers in their meditation on the immutable. It is neither gross nor minute, neither short nor long, without eyes or ears, without the vocal organ or mind, without interior or exterior. This immutable is never seen but is the witness. It is never thought, but is the thinker. It is never known, but is the knower. Besides this lofty conception of the absolute transcendent reality, the one without a second, there developed in ancient India the ideas of an immanent, impersonal divine principle, which manifests itself through finite forms and yet remains infinite and formless. This was what later on came to be called the school of qualified non-dualism, that is, Visishtadvaita. Many aspirants prefer to worship such a divine principle as they feel no interest in the personal aspect of the divine. The Upanishads themselves contain meditations on the divine immanence in all creation. He is below, He is above, He is at the back, He is in the front, He is in the south, He is in the north, He indeed is everywhere and in everything, says Chandogya Upanishad. He is subtler than the subtlest, vaster than the vastest, the self-seated in the hearts of all beings, says the Katha Upanishad. He exists in and through the earth, the air, the sun, the moon, and the stars. He controls everything and every being from within. He is the internal ruler, the immortal self of the worshipper, says Brihadaranyaka Upanishad. The devotee retains the distinction between him and the divine. He considers himself as a soul and God as the soul of all souls. Om Shanti 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 Hari Om Tat Sat.